Hello everyone. In this video, we're going to talk about health organizations and organizational communication in general. This is the corporate and health major, and hey, this is kind of the corporate and health combined at this point. Um, so there's a lot of org-comm theory in here. We want to think about its implications in the specific healthcare setting. I'll use a lot of examples from hospitals, reference the textbook a lot, and hopefully we can make sense of some of this unique setting in which organizational communication is occurring. So as an overview, we are going to talk about how organizations are a site of interaction and sometimes conflicting goals. There's this principle of structural divergence the textbook is introducing us to, in the sense that a hospital or a healthcare organization in general might be the nexus of incompatible structures. This is probably true of every organization, but there's some unique considerations in the hospital setting. What that means is, well, people might find themselves caught in ethical dilemmas often. They might be in a double bind, as it were. And we might find ourselves asking the question of who's left holding the bag, right? When things flow downhill, as they will, the frontline workers often get stuck in some interesting situations. We also have additional considerations of stress, emotional exhaustion, and burnout. This is an exhausting profession to be in. But it's the emotional labor of this is often what brings people to the profession, right? People become doctors because they do care about healing people. Maybe they just want a big salary. Uh, but most people are in fact people, and this is a field that is to heal people, to help people. And so the kind of people that are drawn to that possession might, or profession might already be fairly emotionally intelligent. So that's something that we do want to keep in mind. You may recall that back from the patients and providers lectures we discussed earlier. So we need to keep this in mind. Particularly because of things like burnout and emotional exhaustion are going to increase turnover in any organization. In the case of hospitals, that's going to increase medical mistakes. And in a country where this is a huge issue, we have a lot of problems with medical mistakes. I mean, not to oversell it and make you fear the medical institutions as a whole, but there's more medical mistakes than we would probably be comfortable with. Um, well, we really need to care about the people's well-being. An example of something like a double bind might be if a nurse doesn't agree with a specific treatment, if she doesn't think that the patient should get the COVID-19 vaccine, for instance. In informal surveys, I would probably guess that about half of nurses and a similar number of doctors are like, no, I'm not so sure about this. About like the regular population, right? Everyone else. They're not all on the same page just because they're doctors, right? Or nurses. But that might be a double bind. If the nurse does not believe in the treatment, for instance, that's going to cause emotional stress. Forget about the outcome. Forget about whether or not she says something or does something different, he or she. Um, that's still a double bind that causes emotional problems for that individual. It's tension, and that can lead to exhaustion and burnout. So, thankfully, all of these issues are things that communication can help with. So, let's dig into that. Now, we want to be digging into these issues in three main areas, reflecting kind of the textbook's discussion of healthcare administration or leadership, human resources, and work environment, and also marketing and PR in terms of these are some things that all organizations have to deal with. What do they look like in the healthcare setting, and what are some considerations there? Beginning with administration and leadership, we have good leaders, we have bad leaders. There's a lot of study and research on this. I'm sure you're familiar with some of it if you've taken some of our organizational communication or corporate communication classes. But what does that look like here? Well, these days, one of the most popular, at least from a research perspective and ethical perspective, and kind of where we're at as a society, is we think that good leaders are servant leaders in a way. Why? How? What does that look like? What does it mean? Well, a servant leader would be someone who's open to ideas and concerns of their team members, first and foremost. So, well, yeah, that's pretty uh, not controversial, right? That a good leader knows what's happening at all levels of their organization. A good general is going to have some idea as to what people on the front lines are going through and what their needs are. Uh, best leaders throughout history, best generals throughout history embody those kind of qualities. So what does that look like? So this is what we call servant leadership. Um, Part of the benefit of this is that the leaders are in better touch with with the people below them, as it were, and that they can then in turn be encouraged to be decisive and accountable. Empowered is a nicer way of saying that, but a good leader is going to set up a system in which their workers are going to be able to make good decisions and see the consequences of those decisions, good and bad. How realistic is this? Well, you've probably been in organizations or workplaces before where this was not the case, that the leader does not view themselves as a servant at all. They just kind of maybe show up sometimes. They worked hard to be at the top, and they're not really going to concern themselves with us lesser plebeians down here at the bottom. But a servant leadership kind of model is going to be doing what we see in this figure, inverting the pyramid, as it were. So we would ideally have the people who are most influential in the system are the people that are most impacted by the system, which would be customer, or in this case, patients, right? But also those frontline workers. Who's interfacing with the public? They're the ones whose opinions you really want to know. But again, is this an ideal or is it a necessity? It's probably a little bit of both. We do know that workers respond better to this type of leader. We do know that these type of leaders tend to have more successful organizations. So is it an ideal? Absolutely. Not everyone is this way. Not everyone has the skills, the personality traits to be a servant leader. But on the other hand, we do know that when they do, it goes a lot better. So again, we want to consider the stresses of the real world, not just burnout and emotional exhaustion and stress like that, but again, if we're talking about hospitals, this is a high octane environment. There's a lot of consequences. There's a lot of throughput. There's people coming in. There's demands needed, and a lot of people's lives are literally at stake here. Well, literally their lives. So when you start increasing those stakes and the pace of the organizational culture, maybe this gets a little bit harder, but at the same time, it might be even more necessary because the most controversial claim I might make here is that any organization that doesn't embody some elements of servant leadership is probably going to fail eventually. It's a matter of scale at that point. A hospital that doesn't have these kinds of systems, well, the administrators, you need to at least get those supervisors, if not the executives, the people who are high up enough to change the conditions. They have to know what conditions to change. That's kind of the bottom line with most of this leadership stuff. So what does it look like? Again, inverting that pyramid, putting the executives on the bottom, responding to everyone above them. They shouldn't just be detached from society. They should be building relationships with their workers, with their community, with their customers, their patients, by listening. One way to do this would be executive rounds. The textbook tells us a story about an executive who would start his day by going around talking to all the people and saying, "How can I make your job easier? How can I help you? What do you need to do your job?" That's good. Another characteristic of this would be to push decision making to the lowest level possible. So again, how practical is that in most situations? I don't know. But this research is pointing to two conditions that should probably be met before that is possible. So the lowest level possible would look like this. Does the individual have stakes? And do they have the expertise? So those conditions, those are preconditions for this to be possible. We can't just push it down to someone who's like, all right, they're at the bottom of the pyramid, lowest paying member. Let's go ask them. That's not how this works. What should be happening is that we're talking to the people who have skin in the game, as it were. The people who are there, those frontline workers, are going to know better than anyone else what is needed on the front line. It's that basic principle here that we're seeing again. Leaders should care what those people think. And so another question that could be asked, for example, during like executive rounds is, what kind of dumb rules get in the way of your job? What kind of policies make your job harder, right? Rules should not be arbitrary. They should be beneficial. These kinds of leaders should also be holding people accountable, ideally without punishment. One of the examples the textbook gave us was like, well, they post the survey results for each individual group so that people could see, oh, we could do better because that group's doing better, right? That kind of stuff. I mean, could we think of better examples of that? Maybe, but the point is that people see consequences from their actions. That shouldn't be the same as punishment. And that is a very fine line to walk, and that is a hallmark of a good leader, is someone who knows the difference between discipline and punishment. The simple difference would be that discipline is related to the actions and the consequences of. Punishment might be arbitrary, right? Docking someone's pay or something like that. That's less beneficial. It just kind of creates resentment and increases turnover. So the recommendation here would be, what kind of measurements would help, would the employees like to know about? So what are those frontline, what's a meaningful metric for those people on the front line? Right? How do they measure success? Well, that would be a good place to start too. Again, this is all possible by kind of inverting that pyramid and actually forming relationships with people. A good leader should also give constructive feedback, not just that didn't work, do better, right? There should be some direction given. That's pretty self-explanatory. Also, we want to create a culture that celebrates successes and heroes, right? We want to be able to see exemplars of what's going well, and we want to point at that, and we want to say, that went great. I mean, this isn't just organizational communication. Some of this is like positive framing kind of stuff. Like, you as an individual can enact this in your day-to-day life. Did you celebrate any of your successes? Hey, you got out of bed. Sometimes that's all someone can do, you know? When you're burnt out and you show up for school or work anyway, give yourself a pat on the back. Say, hey, you showed up. That's great. So that's a simple way that this can affect us in our day-to-day life. But in the organizational setting, you do want to celebrate when things go well. Thank you cards, bonuses, whatever it may be. Just make sure that people are seeing positive consequences to their actions other than not being punished. Let's talk about human resources now. Human resources is, again, this is not something we should take for granted. This is another school of thought that's coming out of organizational communication. It wasn't always this way, right? Back in the early 20th century, the attitude towards workers was that they were cogs in a machine and they were to be treated in that way. We've come a little bit farther than that in modern history. Human resources is a response to that. Now, we might talk about human resources kind of ironically because sometimes it feels like they're not particularly devoted towards creating a good work environment, but that is ostensibly the goal of human resources. Create a good work environment so that your workers work better. So theories for human resources, we've got a bunch of theories we can go through. Here you see what I think of when I think of human resources and people working on the front lines. This is just a screen grab from the Venture Brothers. These are henchmen for the monarch. And when I think of human resources and people being treated like cogs in a machine, I always think of henchmen. But at any rate, let's look at some theoretical grounding for human resources. That's what the textbook is mostly giving us. You may find this useful as you think about how people, what kind of conditions, real world conditions people have, and what their motivations and behaviors take out of that. So one example here is the theory of personal causation. This is a very simple idea that we can take away from this, is that people don't like to be used for the most part. People don't like being treated like pawns. They would rather be treated like they have some agency. They prefer to be, as this theory is saying, origins, active participants in their lives, in their work, in their organization. Another popular theory you might have heard of from organizational communication is the theory X versus theory Y, styles of management. This is coming from McGregor in 1960. Yes, the 60s, that's about when we started thinking about human well-being in the workplace. But theory X managers have this tendency, according to McGregor, to believe that people are lazy and they need to be disciplined, they need to be driven, they need to be poked and prodded to do the thing that they have to do. They're basically just wild animals. Well, sometimes that's true, but theory Y managers have a different perspective. They believe that people do like to be rewarded and are motivated to make positive difference in their lives and in their workplace. Now, we could probably think of examples of either of these things being true, but the reality is If you treat someone the way you want them to be, they're more likely to act that way. If we treat them like they're cogs in the machine, that's how they're going to feel. You could apply this to learned helplessness. You could think of this even, I can think of plenty of depressing examples of old folks' homes. People tend to have their life expectancy drop after they've entered into hospice or old folk homes, uh, nursing communities. Once they're in those kind of situations, if they're neglected, if they feel like their family doesn't care about them anymore, people's life expectancy tends to drop a little bit. That's an example of learned helplessness, right? We've talked about that before, but you get the idea. Likewise, if we treat our workers like they're garbage, they're probably not going to be very good workers. So regardless of whether or not we think this reflects actual human nature, that people are more lazy or that they do like to be rewarded and motivated, uh, you probably want to treat them like they're useful so that they have the potential to grow into someone who's useful. Motivation hygiene theory. Moving all the way back to up to 1968 here, talking about a couple of other nuances to add to that mix of theory X and theory Y. You've got motivating factors, and then you also have what this theory calls hygiene factors. So the motivating factors would be making a difference, being respected, being appreciated, learning, improving. All that stuff would be considered a motivating factor. But then there are also hygiene factors. How good is the pay? What are the working conditions? What are the nature of the rules and policies? Do they interfere or do they enable? So these are all considerations for human resources. This is the groundwork that was laid for human resources to start thinking about the well-being of their workers, because the idea is here that a happy worker is a more productive worker. That does seem to be true pretty much any time we ask the question, with some exceptions. So better work environments generally lead to better workers. Here again, we see that people do best when they are informed, engaged, empowered. Sounds great. How do we do that? Well, we have to create an environment that prevents burnout. And we've talked a little bit about stress and burnout in the past. We need to make sure that people are able to rest and rejuvenate and recover, and that they have supportive relationships, and that they feel like their job matters rather than is just busy work. But speaking of double binds, right, when these systems get in place, people might have a harder time feeling that way. And when people feel, for example, unrewarded and overworked for long enough, that's a bad problem. That's a serious problem, not just for their personal health, but it's a problem for the organization, because this leads to greater turnover. That means people come and go. When people come and go, you're spending more money on training, you're spending more energy, time, and so you can see again how if we don't deal with these kinds of problems on the front end, you're going to have to deal with it on the back end. We can, of course, temper this with realism and say, how does this work in our culture? Well, I don't think it's any secret that our work culture needs a little bit of work, as it were. I do think that we as a culture are thinking about the nature of work. And there are a lot of things in flux, this historical context, that are probably going to dramatically change the nature of work for your generation or the generations that come after us here than have been dealt with before. So we'll see how this goes. We do want to question, and people are beginning to question, well, what are the incentives for administrators? Are there incentives to truly get down on the front lines and talk to their workers, or is it to just stay in their office and try and put out fires as they emerge? Well, again, there will be fewer fires if we deal with it on the front end. All right, let's move our discussion here to marketing, PR, and service. These are some of these cultural aspects of organizations that are, well, arguably more important or unique, different in the healthcare context. Thinking about marketing, um, image, branding, reputation, and things like that in the arena of healthcare is that we want to remember that this is not just an image thing. It's not just a branding thing. We are, in fact, talking about health services. So the image and reputation of the organization has implications for healthcare access, as in some of our health messaging that we're working on for our projects, for instance. One of the things we might target is getting the right message, getting the right services to the right people. So that's a marketing thing. That's a branding thing. Does the message get to where it needs? That's a strategic communication thing. This has implications for access. It has implications for support, whether it's from external funders, whether it's from patient satisfaction perspective, or the support of executives. So some best practices when it comes to this stuff involve focusing on relationships because again, this is not just selling iPhones. This is selling healthcare. We are giving health and healing to individuals. That the nature of this relationship is an exchange relationship. It should be beneficial to, well, ideally both parties, but it is focused on healing. And we have to remember that. So as we've seen in the past with patient and provider communication, there should be a strong emphasis on relationships. That should scale all the way up throughout the organization to its image and brand. Now, a good kind of system is going to be integrating that employee feedback for all the same reasons that we talked about with the servant leadership. That's a good practice here for marketing, PR, and service. So ultimately, the health organization should be not just concerned with its image, they should be concerned with their reputation, right? If you go tell your friend, don't go to that hospital, those guys are awful and they almost killed me, that's a problem. That's a problem for your hospital. It's also a problem for the individual who almost got killed, if that's the case. But that's just a kind of off-the-cuff example of this is not just an image thing, right? This is about relationships. It's about reputation. It's about back and forth. And so organizations in the healthcare field do need to be particularly aware of these constraints. Part of this being a reputation thing is that it's also based on values. What are the core values of that organization? What's the mission of that organization? Are they communicating that clearly? And are they avoiding decoupling issues where their image and their actions don't align? Those things should be very closely aligned. And through the actions of the organization, it should be clear what those values and the mission are. So relationships are integral to the success of organizations. This is particularly true in healthcare organizations. So here's some more theories we could think about. The commitment trust theory. This research was demonstrating that in relationships, close relationships, yes, but also the same can be applied to organizations. Commitment and trust are the best predictors of relationship strength. There are some other factors here, whether they have shared values and loyalty to each other. But if an organization is doing well to demonstrate its commitment to the community and its desire to earn their trust, that can go a long way in terms of building this kind of relationship. So relationships help with all of this stuff. And it also increases the sense of stability. If we reduce the sense that this is a transaction, you go in, you get your healthcare, you leave, and we encourage the sense that this is a working relationship between one person and many, or many people and many, or a network of people. But relationships should be stable. And in some ways, if they have commitment and trust, that's something we want to convey through the image of the organization. This also has a role in reducing uncertainty. If the patient views the organization as something, as a group of people that the patient has a relationship with, that can help them reduce uncertainty, which can lead to other issues of literacy, agency, and all that good stuff that contributes to health outcomes. It also has to do with our identity. We define ourselves in relation to our relationships, so it would be good to have good relationships. Orgs need to remember all of this when interacting with patients. That's part of their image. That's part of their PR. It's part of all of that. And it's very, very important. Again, important in many organizations, particularly in healthcare organizations. Another theory we could consider here is two-way symmetrical communication. This is getting redundant at this point. We're just talking about open communication between the organization and the public. If we're talking about relationships, well, those are two-way, right? So there has to be some strong effort to integrate public opinion, patient satisfaction, all of that. It can't just be lip service, particularly not in healthcare. Next, I'd like us to consider crisis communication plans. This is something that is commonly considered for organizations. Hey, it's a hospital, there's going to be crises, there's going to be medical mistakes, and so it becomes very important for this regular occurrence. We cannot consider crisis to be a rare event in the healthcare setting. And so health communication, health organizations are going to need to have good crisis communication plans. They have to manage image in particular, and it requires careful attention and commitment to things, again, like values, the mission, and the capacity to meet unexpected demands. This last one is probably most important for us here. Recognizing that it's a hospital, there's a lot of unexpected stuff that happens in a hospital, including medical mistakes that can have problems for patients. We also want to remember that quality of service plays a role here. So what are some ways we can demonstrate the quality of service? Well, one is by responding well to crises when they emerge. This is a kind of a boilerplate 10-step crisis communication plan. So any organization should have a crisis communication plan. Every organization, no exceptions, because what's a crisis? That is, the definition is that you have a stressor exceed your capacity to cope. Well, organizations have these as well, whether it's a PR crisis or an ethical crisis or corruption or whatever it may be. Every organization needs to have a way of dealing with this. Here's a way of talking about it. Step one would be to anticipate the crisis needs and procedures. Know that this is possible. Two, have a team, have a spokesperson. That's stuff that you need to think about. Three, identify common crisis scenarios. What is most likely to be encountered? Think ahead, anticipate what's going to happen. Also anticipate the stakeholders' questions and provide answers. Develop crisis holding statements. These are the kind of things that can cover a wide range of scenarios, so you're not just starting with nothing when you have a crisis. You should prepare. Again, spokesperson training. Those spokespeople, the teams, they should have training and they should be prepared to respond quickly and well. You should also have crisis monitoring systems. We shouldn't just be flying by the seat of our pants. We should know when something goes wrong before there are bad issues. We shouldn't learn that from the press, right? That's pretty straightforward too. We should also decide what ways are best to interact with the public, whether that's like a press conference or whether that's a issued statement or whatever it might be. In particular today, this modern historic context, we need to think about a social media action plan. Social media is more organic than traditional media have been throughout history. And so when something goes wrong, it can explode, it can go viral very quickly, and that can ruin your image very quickly as well. So this is stuff that we want to be aware of and think about. And of course, number 10 here is just to communicate your message. You can find a million different 10-step or 8-step crisis communication plans. They all have the same similar elements here. You want to be prepared. You don't want to be dealing with a crisis when it comes at you. That's not a great time. There's lots of opportunity to deal with this on the front end. You should have a way to deal with it, not simply hoping the crisis does not find you. If you're in a healthcare organization, there are crises every day. Hopefully not a ton of medical mistakes every day, but there's going to be crisis all the time. That's kind of the business. And so this kind of stuff becomes hugely important in healthcare organizations. I'll leave this here as we exit out of this video lecture, thinking about tips for building a culture of service. This is also coming from the textbook just as a reminder of ways that people, I mean, this is working out ahead of crises, sure, but this is also building that image, that reputation, and I think it feeds all the way back to the servant leadership and what this looks like in practice. The organization be trying to go beyond expectations. We should be trying to do more than the bare minimum. That seems like it should go without saying, but again, doing more than simply what is expected to you. Yeah, we expect a hospital to keep us alive, and we would really like them to help us get healthier, but we would really like them to help us feel better. So maybe some of this is a framing thing and what we expect the hospitals to do, but no organization, particularly in something that is in a care field, should be just trying to do the bare minimum. That's not a very successful business model. Ways we could do this is to recognize and create moments of truth. That's coming from the specific research. The textbook is referencing this and saying that a moment of truth is when impressions of the organization emerge based on how individuals are treated. Think of this in terms of narratives. When something happens that shapes your perspective of how that organization works and what it stands for, that would be kind of a moment of truth. You'd rather have good ones than bad ones. Likewise, if there's a service failure, if there's a crisis, if there's a medical mistake, we need to treat that as an opportunity to do better. Again, this is true in any industry. However, it's particularly true here. When the customer is least satisfied, is a great chance to do everything up here. Recognize and create moments of truth and go beyond expectations. So the expectations are pretty low when everything's gone wrong. Great chance to do better. Also tell stories and honor heroes. Think about that celebrating success tip we saw earlier here, is that what does doing this well look like? That's what you want to focus on. A little bit of hero worship here. So-and-so did a great job, employee of the month. That shouldn't just be making other employees jealous. That should be saying, well, here's what they did that really worked. And that's what we're about. That. Have something to point to. That's wonderful. So that's part of that celebrating victories thing. Stories of exemplars help reinforce cultural expectations and the image of the organization. As we wrap up here, I feel like invoking common sense, or maybe you do. Maybe this sounds like some really obvious stuff that of course, of course we should care about people and, be servant leaders and all that. But this stuff is really hard in practice, particularly because of all those incentives, those structures, the pressures, uh, particularly in a healthcare organization. The pace can be frenetic and crazy, and things are changing all the time. You might have an unexpected health crisis like COVID-19 where no one knew what was going on for those weeks. Um, we need to be aware that those kinds of challenges are going to interfere with our ability to do all of this and to do it well. And so thinking ahead, much like with the crisis communication plan, thinking about this and what it looks like in practice is really a great place to start. This is not just good information for leaders, this is good information for you as well, because you can identify some harmful work environment conditions that interfere with the health of the organization and health of patients. So I hope that we can work with this and consider it as you go forward. Even if you're never working in healthcare organizations, you're going to be working in something. And these principles apply there, maybe just in a slightly different way. But if we can keep these things in mind, we can get out ahead of this curve, get out ahead of this wave, that is a good organization. That works a lot better. All right, that's enough for today. I hope that helps you out. I'll see you in the next video.